Welcome to War of the Currents. Today, we'll be discussing the fabled War of the Currents, where Tesla's AC faced off against Edison's DC. We'll dive in depth on two main issues. First, we'll have Sam talk about the surface skin problem with AC current. Second, we'll all talk about AC versus DC motors. But first, some background. The simplest form of current is direct current, or DC. It's what most devices run on, and it's as simple as hooking up a battery to a light bulb. Power flows from one point to the other in an essentially consistent, constant manner. Thomas Edison, inventor extraordinaire, used low-voltage DC current for everything he created, inventing and then selling a whole ecosystem of DC current devices, including incandescent light bulbs. Light was produced through these bulbs by running power through a filament inside of the bulb. The filament would heat up and produce light. Nikola Tesla, on the other hand, pushed AC current as the future of electricity. He and Edison fought for years over what current would reign supreme. At the time, AC current was only used to power high-voltage streetlights, specifically arc lamps, which worked by having electricity arc from one point to the other, ionizing the gases in between the two and energizing them as to make them spontaneously give off light. This required a large amount of voltage though, and at the time, DC current simply could not be stepped up to produce such high voltage. As a consequence of this, AC streetlights soon spread, and an AC network of power stations was built up rapidly. Because AC could be stepped up to produce such high voltage, it was also ideal for transmission over long distances, something that the lower voltage DC current simply could not do without additional power stations in between, wasting electricity. But AC isn't perfect either. Let's go to Sam to discuss the dreaded skin surface effect.
Let's say, in a perfect world, I set up an AC battery and a DC battery at the UW Stadium. Now, I would set these batteries up so that they have the same amps and the same voltage. And then I took a wire with the same length and the same resistance, and I pulled that wire all the way to DTS, where I put a power meter to measure the power output of each battery. Now, what I would find is that the power output of the AC wire would be less than the power output of the DC wire. Now, why is this? We know that power can be measured by amps squared times resistance, and we know the amps are the same and the resistance of the wire are the same. Well, that's not fully true. There is a phenomenon that happens only to AC current called the skin effect. In this phenomenon, if we cut this wire right in half and we looked in, we would see that the electrons would only be utilizing the skin and not the core of the wire. This, namely, is called the skin effect. Now, let's discuss why this phenomenon happens. Here, I just have a diagram of a wire, and let's say my finger here represents an electron. Now, in both DC and AC, from a dead stop, they're going to flow downwards. In AC, we know that's not the full story, but let's discuss the effects of this before we incorporate the alternator. So, we know that a current flowing will induce a magnetic field. This can be modeled by our equation B, magnetic field, equals the parameter of free space times current over 2 pi, the radius of the wire. So, with our current flowing down here, what we're going to do is we're going to use our thumb rule, and we can see that the magnetic field, shown here in green, will wrap around this way. Now, this is a good model of a DC wire. We have that current and we have that magnetic field flowing around. However, in AC, now here comes the full story, it will bounce back and the current will flow the other direction. So let's erase this and let's model a current flowing upwards. So we have our current from the bottom going up, modeled here in blue, and we have our magnetic field going the opposite direction. Now, let's take a step back here and remember one physics phenomenon. When the magnetic field changes, it will induce a voltage. And modeled here with voltage equals change in magnetic flux over change in time times coil. And we know in that AC current, we just wrote it right here, that magnetic field flipped. So what's going to happen because of that flip, there's going to be a magnetic field. So we'll just label that P. And because we're going to induce a voltage around it, we're going to write our circle, and we're going to go arrows up there, arrows down, and from here, goes up and goes down. Now, I'm sure you can see the problem with this and why the skin effect is so prevalent. Let's again say the tip of my finger is an electron, and I'm flowing from the bottom and I'm trying to go up. I'm going to find it really easy to just follow the arrows of the induced current and flow around the skin. And I'm going to find it harder to go through the middle where these induced currents are pushing back on you. Now this concept is really the stepping stone of the skin effect. Current induces a magnetic field, induces voltage, which is that pushback. Now that's why the current utilizes the skin and less the coil. Now, one more thing I want to briefly mention about this skin effect is that it gets worse with the frequency of the alternating current. And if we think about this, if the alternating current is going back and forth really fast, there's going to be a high rate of change of the flux, and thus is going to be the higher induced voltage. And if we think about it, that's the force pushing the electrons to the side. So, with a high frequency, we're going to get a more skin effect. We'll just call it skin effect force. But what that really means is a higher resistance and a worse skin effect.
First of all, AC works by switching the polarity, or direction, of the circuit constantly at 60 times per second. Usually, with a normal DC current, you have two static magnets and a rotating central electromagnet. The electromagnet is powered in such a way that each end is charged the same as the closest static magnet, and as opposite fields repel, the ends are pushed away and spin. However, you need to turn this power off briefly throughout the rotation, or else the motor will lock up as similar forces attract, so the magnet will be attracted to the similar electromagnets, and it'll just get stuck. Now, this may work for some applications, but there's a much better way, and it's called the polyphase induction motor. The polyphase induction motor works by taking advantage of AC's alternation instead of requiring the circuit to turn on and off constantly. Think about it this way. Edison's DC current is like trying to ride a bicycle. You just push, but you can only really push the pedals down when the pedals are level so that you can push them around. You can't push them when they're at the apex because you can't really push downwards into metal. You'll be putting all that force into the bicycle frame. You can sort of manually sometimes have to move the pedal to a better location to get more leverage when you're starting out a race or, moving around somewhere. And it works okay. But there's a better way. If Edison's DC motor is like riding a bicycle normally, Tesla's AC polyphase motor is like riding a bicycle with your feet glued to the pedals, and you have 3 feet now, or more actually. This way, no matter what orientation the pedals start at in, there's always going to be at least one with really good leverage to be able to push that down and start the current up again. That's the physical benefit of the motor. But how does it work at an electromagnetic level? Well, when electricity is passed through a wire, it creates an electric field right next to it. You can increase this effect by making a coil of wire, and boom, you've got an even stronger magnetic field. These magnetic fields are created in a field around the wire, and because of AC current being in 3 phases, polyphase, the magnetic field will rotate around the center of the motor, so the magnetic field's direction will constantly be turning up and down, but rotating in a constant way. Now, if you place a closed-circuit conductor in the middle of this field, like a loop of wire, perhaps, the changing of magnetic field will create a magnetic flux in the wire, induce an electromotive force, or EMF, which will create current running through the wire. This will create a Lorentz force on the closed-circuit conductor, which will physically rotate it, and boom, you got a motor. The only caveat is that the magnetic field needs to be moving faster than the motor itself, or else you don't have any change in magnetic field, it's just a constant magnetic field. But other than that, it's perfect. Nowadays, 90% of all motors are AC induction motors, and DC motors are relegated to much less high-intensity workloads, relegated to, smaller, unimportant things. Back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Ethan. Well, that was just two aspects of a much larger war of currents. We haven't talked about how Edison used crazy ways to slander Tesla and AC. For example, electrocuting elephants and advocating that AC be used in prisoner executions. Yeah. And we didn't even talk about transformers, an integral part of why we use AC while we were building our power grids. Thank you.